Hi friends, this is Ray Lutz with Citizens Oversight. And today we're going to talk about, did Trump steal the 2024 election? This question about whether or not the election was conducted properly is something that we as citizens should rightly do. This is not something that is a wrong thing to do. It is not election denial to look into what the facts are. It's unfortunately considered taboo by news organizations. We're not here making any claims yet. We're just asking the questions. And we're looking into how we can prove it one way or the other. I'm a computer scientist. My degree is in electronics engineering. Been doing this since 2006 and have had some successes. It takes a while to figure it out because there are only so many elections. And you need to watch them, ask questions, and there's differences everywhere, and so it takes quite a bit of time to figure out what's going on and how can we get to the bottom of this. One thing that did happen was back in 2016, I did sue the County of San Diego for not including 285,000 ballots in the audit. Won the case, then they changed the law and made it so that now they don't have to include those later arriving vote by mail ballots. So that makes the audit here in California pretty weak. They are weak in many places. I'm going to go through now an overview to define and to put into place a few ways of thinking about the different things that happen. We do know that Trump had motive, definitely wanted to win. He had the opportunity. He was working with Elon Musk and others with a lot of capabilities, and he had the means. All of these things were there, and the question is, did it happen? Okay, so categories of action in an election. We have 6 different categories that I've defined here. And basically in the order of time. First, you don't have an election yet. You can do pre-election rigging and anti-rigging actions. Then you have candidates, policies, and platforms. You do messaging and information warfare during the campaign. And then there's when the election is actually running, there's scams that occur. And then there's actually modifying the outcome directly. And this is really what we're going to be looking at more. But I want to put all of these other things aside. And we're going to be looking at checking the results, which is what we as citizens must do because no one else can do it for us. You can't rely upon the government to check itself. Let's talk about pre-election rigging and anti-rigging. I will mention that some studies have shown that these rarely actually have much impact, these various scams that they put in place or work on a lot. With the exception of redistricting, which definitely has a big impact. If it's gerrymandering, if you're trying to rig it in your favor, or you can have independent commissions and try to make it fair. There is senseless manipulation that goes into redistricting. Of course, we know about the Electoral College. It puts favoritism toward, at this time, the Republican Party. Voter ID is actually in 74% of the states already require voter ID. So that's one that they fight over a lot and say that the Democrats don't want it. Most every place requires an ID to register at least. If you're doing vote by mail voting, it's hard to have them submit the ID with that, but that is one option. Now, other things, felony conviction voters, once they've completed their punishment, voter roll purges and registration campaigns and say nay registration. Who's going to be, and this is where a lot of people during the off years can really make progress because there's a big chunk of people who are not registered to vote at all and never vote. There is cooperation to improve the voter roll accuracy in this ericstates.org, or they call it ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. And it was a lot of Republican states pulled out of that. Even though they claim to want voter roll accuracy, they pull out of one of the best things that was around to help make it more accurate. Taking people off the rolls, and actually, if you move into another state, it puts them back on, and that's what they didn't like. limit the polling places. That happens a lot to drop boxes, early voting, and so forth. Recently, scare tactics by privacy activists saying that your vote can be found out and that you're going to be persecuted by the Trump administration. We do want our votes to be private. Very, very rarely can somebody be found out. And if you just pick a person and say, I want to know who that person voted for, nearly impossible. It's a legitimate concern for us to have our votes be private, and it largely is. Okay, let's the next one really quick. The candidates, who's running, is it the right candidate or not? Did you go through the primary? Sometimes that helps people learn who the people are, gives them a lot more airtime. And then what is the platform? Most people don't ever read it. If they have a platform, the candidates don't have to follow it. So they actually avoid talking about it because it means defending the details. The media doesn't like to cover it. It's too detailed. Next thing, this is really where most people, when they're talking about election rigging and fraud, election fraud, they improperly talk about messaging and information warfare. It's a really important area, but it is not actually election fraud per se. So in these campaigns, people are boasting about their credibility and they lie about their opponent's culpability both ways. There's disinformation, bias networks. Lately, we've had this become really important with Musk and his purchase of Twitter, and then this bandwagon effects, the information scams, birth certificates erased, Russian meddling, all these things are fought over. And a lot of times they're false information, but they're something that people can get into. So information warfare, we're not going to be working on this. All right, next is scams during the election itself. We've heard about this, like 90 bomb threats around the country. I heard there were 60 bomb threats in Georgia alone. What's that going to do? That's going to scare people. I better not vote. I might be killed. All right. And so the Republican Party has stated clearly in the past that their goal is to have the least number of people vote. They want to reduce the turnout. And that's one way to do it. The more people that vote, the less likely they are to vote for the Republican Party to win. They like to do off-year elections, push things through when not too many people are watching. And I mean, they've stated it clearly, that's their agenda. So this is the threats. We had lottery rewards this time to register and vote. Some people were winning $1 million. That could probably influence a few people. I don't know if that's actually legal. We can look into that as a separate project. Sometimes they send out voting location or date misinformation. And they say, oh, your polling place has been moved. And actually the date's been changed. It's now a week later than the election. And so people will get that and go, oh, okay, well, we thought it was this week. It's actually next week. They would miss voting then. Usually don't know whoever sent it, and then they have suppressed the vote again. Now, so all those things there we're actually not going to be talking about in detail. I'm going to be going into more detail on this one, modifying the outcome. That is actually changing the results of the election after all of the other stuff has been done. And the election has been in process and completed. So we have two basic categories here, prior to or during the scanning process. So when you vote, if you go in to vote in person and you get either a ballot and you vote with filling in the bubble, or you use a touchscreen type, what they call ballot marking device machine, then when you use those machines, you get your ballot either printed out from the BMD machine or you just marked it, and then it gets fed into a scanner, either right there at the polling place, or it may be transported into a central office to be scanned. So that time before the scanning happens is what we're talking about here. Mail ballots are mostly susceptible, so mail ballots are sent out in the mail, and then they're typically not mailed back. The person can return them in any way, either by mail or putting them in a drop box or carrying them directly into the office. One of them was to intercept the mail ballots as they're sent out, so they haven't quite reached the voter yet. And then the person who is the fraudster would capture those ballots, still in envelopes, take them out of the envelope, mark the ballot how they want it voted, and then forge a signature on the return envelope and send it in. So the person never got it. And they may detect this if the voter who was intended for notices that they say, well, I haven't voted yet. And the person says, yes, you have. We've received a ballot from you. And they go, oh, no, I didn't vote yet. So that's how it can trigger a detection. This happened in this election. They have found one case of this. It wasn't too many ballots, and usually they're not. So these cases here are usually not very many ballots, but they have been found at least one time in this election, but also in prior elections. In the 9th Congressional District in North Carolina, the Republican operatives were intercepting mail ballots after being voted and before it's sent in, and then they would steam them open and change the votes, either by overvoting on the one they didn't like or was left blank, then they would fill it in. Now, if you picked up ballots by maybe going to a retirement home and picking up ballots and then bringing them in, that's not malicious if you don't discard some of the ballots or change any of them. You're just bringing them in. But the temptation is there and it's hard to control. So they've actually used to allow this in California. They allowed picking them up, bringing them in. But now they've done away with that. So even at, say, election or party headquarters, say the Republican Party has a drop box in there at their door, put your ballot in here and we'll bring it in for you. That's against the law now, which is good because it eliminates the temptation for somebody to actually pick them up and then change them. The ballots could be directly created, particularly if you were in cahoots with the print shop that actually was making the ballots to begin with, or you could get some paper and that's the right thickness and you could get the files and you could print them yourself and then you have some ballots. These days the ballots are not controlled by a scarcity concept. So there's so many ballots that are sent out in vote by mail, especially in California. Everybody gets a vote by mail ballot. And so there's a lot of ballots around. What's scarce is the envelope that you put it in and that you have to sign. It has a name on it with barcodes and other things for control. Those are a little bit harder to create. But if you were at the print shop, you would be able to create those return envelopes and do it right. And then, of course, you would have to forge the signatures. The signatures are available fairly easily. You can find somebody's signature on legal documents at the recorder's office, for example. Now, that's one way to add votes, add ballots into the mix. And this is one that we're concerned about is adding additional ballots in this election. And also intercepting mail ballots after being voted and then discard them. This is the easiest way to affect the outcome of the election. We have people within the Postal Service that may want to look for these. In fact, in this intercepting the mail ballots as they were sent out, one of the people involved in the scheme was working for the Postal Service. And so they were able to capture them that way. So that is definitely something that is possible. Now, once they're received, there is signature inspection that goes on, and they need to either accept or reject those signatures that they're matching with signatures on file. And this is a way they can detect people doing the forging of signatures this route if they do the signature comparisons here. Now, you don't need that if you intercept it after they're voted because these are already signed. So the ballots are already signed and they're going to match, but you've intercepted them and now you open them up, change the ballot, and they are not going to detect that based on signature comparisons because signature is correct. As the election is going on, is by scanning batches multiple times or ignoring them. If you have batches that may be sorted even by who's on there, if you want to, you could say we're just going to leave those out, or we can swap them with ballots marked the way we want them marked. So once you get past this threshold of accepting the ballots into the facility, then the question is, what ballots are being scanned? Because you could just take, okay, we're not going to scan this batch. We're going to swap it out with another batch of ballots marked the way we want them marked. And that's a fairly low-tech way to handle this. It does require corruption within the election office, but these days we had a lot of people looking to put MAGA supporters and so forth within those election offices so that they could have these sort of effects. Now there's configuration hacks which you could set up where on the ballot, and I'm talking about the type of ballot with the bubbles that you mark. If you have a ballot with bubbles in two places, let me show you. Okay, so this is an example of a ballot. It's actually a test ballot. And if we had two bubbles here, and the election equipment is going to have a position on the ballot for that, and that's determined by counting these timing marks on the side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, down until you get to where it is lined up with this bubble and this number over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 or whatever right here, and that's going to line up with there. So these are how they know where the bubble is by this XY coordinate system. Now, if you have an XY coordinate for this bubble here and you swap it with the XY coordinate for that bubble in your configuration, then every vote for Monica Ashton, in this case, the top one, would be voted for Mark Pirzakala. Difficult name. You would only want to do that hack if you knew that you were probably going to lose, and you wanted to take every vote for, let's say, every vote for Harris and swap it over for Trump, and then Trump would win. Now, this is I can actually show you the demonstration of this hack, which is possible to do very quickly in the Dominion equipment. Now, this is an ES&S ballot, but all the equipment is basically malleable once you get into the main election management system, which I'm going to go over this in detail later. But if you swap these bubbles in the configuration, then the results would be exactly reversed from the accurate results. What you would see on the paper would be the opposite of what goes into the machine. You could say, you check this paper and see where that bubble is, or check the image. The image is also going to be showing the bubble in the correct place, but in the computer would be assigned to the wrong candidate. Since they're all changed, you could check just one ballot and you would find it. So it's very easy to find. If you're a little bit more crafty, you would be able to hide your changes and no one would ever find them. And that's fairly easy to do with some of the systems they have set up. Now, that's before scanning. We can only sometimes catch these things. I guess I should put the configuration hacks after scanning, because that is something that you can detect in an audit. Okay, so I'll put that one down here. Too few or double uploads of the data. Some of these systems don't really track very well how many when a precinct is uploaded, it should know that's the precinct at a certain number and it should know where it is. They don't track it very well. They rely upon humans to do a good job of keeping track, even though the computer should be able to do that. And so as a result, a lot of times in the last couple of elections, we've noticed that they have doubly uploaded the data or missed it and didn't upload the data. Next one is really important. And the reason is because this can be a very significant change, as it's a very powerful change. These other things that we talked about, such as intercepting mail ballots as they're sent out for, that is hard because you have to go out and get each one. If you said, I want to do that 150,000 times, that would be hard to do. And by the time you get up into that range, actually anything over 50, I've noticed, is when they start to get caught. If they're even less than 50, they sometimes are caught doing this. So you can't do this very much before you're starting to get caught from, especially forging signatures. However, they did catch this one too in the ballot harvesting, North Carolina in that case. But we don't know. If they don't catch it, then we would never see it, would we? So these, though, are these things prior to scanning are difficult to catch. And even when people say, well, we're going to do hand counting doesn't catch these things necessarily either. At this point, after you've scanned, now you have hopefully locked down a ballot image that can be not altered because we have it locked down with some security codes. Now, so we're getting down here to manipulating the votes in the database directly. And people say, oh, we're worried about Starlink, Elon Musk, and then someone else says, no, that can never happen. Actually, it can happen. You can have compromised workers get things set up so that Starlink would be acceptable, or any kind of wireless communication might be acceptable. It's very, very hard to guarantee that there's no wireless communication at all going to a machine, unless you put it in a screen room, a Faraday cage, so that no wireless can be used. And you've also made sure that there's no wires or connections directly. If you did get some kind of internet connectivity, then you could have remote actors make those changes to the machines at any time. Like, if they don't have to use Starlink, they could just use a wireless Wi-Fi. When they take over a machine, all they do is plug in a device for a few seconds, and it loads itself in. You can pull the USB drive out, and now the computer is taken over with it's a little bit of code in there that's hard to find that will allow it to use, if there's modems on the machine, so sometimes they're integrated into the motherboard and really impossible to take out. They could add a device so that it could possibly go up to Starlink if you have compromised workers. Now, that is manipulating the votes in the database directly. And people will say, you can't just modify the database. Well, actually, now we know that you can. This was actually divulged to us in the recent Tina Peters case in Mesa County, Colorado, where she was convicted to 9 years incarceration for that. But in her technical report, which we'll take a look at, they did reveal that there was additional software on the machine, which comes stock with all Dominion machines. They put in this additional program that lets you change the database without being tracked by the election management system. Very bad idea, but it's in there. Okay, so this is where we need to assume that this could occur. We need to assume that it is possible that the votes in the database were directly modified. Okay, because it is possible. We can't prove it really, like after the fact. You can't say, well, I'm going to prove that somebody had a wireless device hooked up, and it's like impossible to prove this. So we need to be able to detect this later, and that's what we're going to talk about in a second. So there's some other things that happen after scanning. Sometimes they will just try stopping the counting. Just don't count anymore. Trump tried this in the 2020 election. He said, stop counting in Arizona. I don't like where it's going. I want you to stop. And then later, how could that be thought of as a legitimate thing? Is that election rigging? Yes, it absolutely is. If you try to stop the count, then that is not a good thing. But sometimes you just change the announced results. In Venezuela, the incumbent said, I won by so many votes. And fortunately, the public had collected the tapes, and they were able to prove that the other guy won. Now, I don't actually know the disposition of that right now. It's something we can look into. But these voting machines in Venezuela are very good. They have things that our voting machines don't have. Now, one thing that gripes me is the announcing the results early or conceding prior to any certification of any results. This happened. Today is Wednesday, and some states have certified their results, but almost none have gone through the process of looking at any paper to determine if the paper matches the result. And you can't detect this manipulation of the votes in the database directly. See, if you do this, then the outcome in any kind of official report will not match the paper. And therefore, by inspecting the paper, tabulating it separately, you can detect this manipulation in the machine. If you don't do that, of course, you're not going to detect this, right? And if you only check a very tiny number of those and you do it in such a way that you miss the ones that you change, you're not going to detect it either. So I'm against conceding prior to certification and pushing them to do it. You should be able to say, I provisionally concede, maybe it looks like I'm going to be losing once all of the certification is done. But really, whether you concede or not is irrelevant. The system itself is going to tell you who won. Now, I guess you can say, I'm not going to take the seat. I decided I'm not going to follow through. You assume that the people running for office will eventually do it, but sometimes they will. They'll sign up and then drop out. A lot of times you'll have shills, what they call shills, when you do that, where you get a few more people on there that are maybe well-known names, but they decided not to really run. The Associated Press is really not an official player in the election, but they want the power of calling them. But really, that's not an official part of the election. All right. Now, I mentioned the fact that we can detect the manipulation of the votes in the database directly by checking the paper or the other evidence that we have in the election. And so these paper ballots, the record, the voter verifiable record that is created, really important. But they only really do anything if they're checked. You have to take a look at them and see if they match before they're of any value. Unfortunately, we currently have weak, non-existent, or late auditing of the paper and or ballot image records. Some states say we have gold standard and we do all this, and we really look into it. They're looking at very, very few ballots. Colorado says they have the gold standard. In a typical county, they'll look at maybe 78 ballots, maybe 100, 200 ballots. It's not very many compared to a couple of 100,000 ballots. And we can go into the details there, but trust me, these are very weak audits that they do, and they're easy to work around. And they realize the election officials are auditing themselves. And that's not going to find too much. They're very easy to rig to find nothing. Even if you change the votes in the database, you can rig it so that they won't find anything. They'll say, well, we're going to audit these batches right here. We pull out 6 batches in advance, and then all the other batches are not going to be audited, so change those. Sometimes they've even announced which batches are going to be auditing on the website prior to the election. Of course, then you know exactly which ones to change. And these internal audits, if they're done poorly, which almost all of them are all theater. They actually will not find anything, and they're designed not to. But here's the problem. It's very difficult for the public to review paper ballots. We can't get to them. I've tried. I've gone through court cases, and even if they say, yeah, you can come and look at them, then you have to be looking at them without any way to do much of anything except to write down what's on it by hand. And that's very hard to do. If you're talking about elections with hundreds of thousands of ballots, you really can't do it by hand. It may take you months and months. We saw in Maricopa County, Arizona, they were well funded and they had a big election to review, 2.1 million ballots. It was the second largest in the nation. It took them months, so 7 months or something, to go through it again by hand. So if you think you can do it by hand, even having separate tables, it is not going to necessarily be as fast as you think it is. What we're doing is independent ballot image audits, and these are feasible in many areas. They're becoming more feasible now. These ballot image audits don't do everything that paper ballot audits will do, but they do a lot. They will be able to detect the manipulation of the votes in the database directly. And that is a really powerful thing. Why? Because you could put this little hack into many, many of the election offices. You only need one per office, per county, because it can change the results for the entire county. And with that hack in place, then you would be able to go into an election in a state, and let's take a state like Nevada has, I think, 15 counties. So you, with only 15 compromised people, you could get these machines hacked. Wouldn't have to necessarily do all of the counties, but then you would be able to inject as much change as you wanted, and as long as you would do it such that their audit would not catch it. So if we have the audits done well, then that would be caught. And the ballot image audits would catch it too. Ballot image audits can go through every single ballot. We have to get to the point here. We need nationally consistent auditing procedures. We don't have them. We have a smattering of different procedures. And a lot of them, even though they're touted as being really, really good, turn out to be, where the way they're implemented, very weak. So what we're promoting now is Audit Engine, which is our approach to being able to look at ballot images. These ballot images are made when the ballots are originally scanned. So back up here, when we're doing the scanning, when those ballots are first put into the machine, that's when that ballot image is made. And by looking at that ballot image, we can see if there's any defects in it, how was it scanned by that scanner. Is it an exact duplicate of another ballot? Did they just take a whole bunch of images and duplicate them? Does it look like other ballots that have been voted already? A lot of these things you can do with the images, and you don't actually need to get to the paper. And there are some things that are paper-based that we can't check with ballot image audit. So to conclude then, I want to say again, public needs to have their eyes open. We need to look at this election very carefully. We need to assume it could have been hacked. Trump and his campaign had all of the three things here: motive, opportunity, and means to do it. We haven't proven anything yet. We're not claiming that they've done it. What we're doing is trying to use science, which is defined as constantly questioning. And so we're going to use science. We're going to constantly question. And we're going to review the evidence to determine what occurred. And this is what our responsibility is as citizens. We need to review this. We do need funding, though, and I hate to have to do this, but we do need to ask for donations. Here's the link. You can go to Citizens Oversight page, to citizensoversight.org, and click on the donate button. I invite you to look at the Audit Engine website and see what that looks like and what we're doing. And we'll be setting up some projects there that you can donate to directly in order to cover the cost of doing the auditing, because we do have computer costs that we have to pay for in order to do these. Now, what we're going to do after this is I'm going to be going into more detail to explain to you how this manipulating the votes in the database directly, why we know that's possible today. And even though they say this can occur, we will be able to prove to you that it can occur. And not that it did occur, but it can. And then we need to actually go through and start looking for when it did happen. We're noticing right now a thing called bullet ballots, where a lot of the ballots have been voted for just Donald Trump and nothing else. And that's kind of rare in practice to see that. And now we're seeing a lot of it. So, and we still need to evaluate what the percentages are, because we just heard about this, but that's another kind of an issue that may come in. And what would that mean? I thank you for allowing me to go on and on here, but I think it was important to cover this paradigm that I set up here, where we're trying to divide things up into things that we know can happen prior to the election, are not actually defined as election fraud. Okay, this one, modifying the outcome, is election fraud. It's a crime. So that's what we're actually going to look for. And we know it can happen, and so we want to look to make sure that if it did happen, then we can take the steps necessary. This is Ray Lutz with Citizens Oversight. I thank you for your time.